Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM, and today we're doing a recap for the first session of the Sands of Calimare, uh, in 2020. Yes. Yes. Okay, good. I just immediately had panic, like, oh my god, did I ever record the previous Sands of Calimere and Frontier videos? But I remember filming Frontier. And if I filmed Frontier, I know I filmed Calimere because I do them both at the same time. Okay, whew, whew. No videos last week. We didn't end up having a session, just to clarify, in either the city or Pirates due to attendance issues. However, that hopefully will cease, though there's also no Frontier this week. Maybe I'll make another video. Again, if you ever want to see a specific video about my setting or the campaigns or homebrew, leave that in the comments if there's something that's just curious about, because it'll help give me direction about something to film, which with my ADHD is appreciated. But let's get past all of that. Let's start today's review for the session I am going to title Whale Song. So picking up where we left off, our party has arrived at Festhala, a hall of joy and celebration, where most of the small folk within Laputa live. Hungry, tired, the party went in and met an interesting character, this suave-looking man with this armor, a sword, a horn at his waist, a large jacket. Someone whose art I definitely should have put in the slides, but didn't because I'm a dumbass. Uh, they ordered some food, which took a little bit of work. The giant working the bar didn't really hear them. This stranger assisted them in getting heard and introduced himself to the party as Luther. And he seemed to be quite smitten, or at least attracted to Blair within the party. Which a lot of the other characters were enjoying and or extremely hesitant of. The giant, Galder, I believe was his name, the bartender who works the bone shift uh, at the ground floor of Festhala, told them that their food would probably take about 30-40 minutes because it was like 4 in the morning, and he doesn't normally cook meals because, again, he normally just tends the bar for the few nocturnal folk. The group started talking about finding somewhere to stay, and Luther offered them his apartment. Uh, he doesn't really use it, and it's large enough for a group of this size, which they were quite happy for. And while they were waiting for their food, he offered to show them some pretty cool things in the city. Riok had wandered off on his own to just be away from the group and to go contact the Lidless Murder, because with his most recent level, Riok had taken a level in Shaman, uh, which, if you are asking, hey Sil, what's a Shaman? I don't see that in the PHP. It is a homebrew class that Riok's player hired me to make through my Fiverr. Just gonna plug that there. Fiverr.com. I think it might be /Selena now. But I do custom homebrew for people for money. And one of those things includes a complete class with 2 subclasses. So Riok took a level in Shaman and wanted to commune with the spirit that he was bonded with, the Lidless Murder, a crow spirit. And the two interacted briefly, but the ability for the spirit to fully pull itself to this world is still very weak. It'll strengthen as he takes levels in the class, but at the moment the connection with the spirit is fairly weak and tenuous. While this was going on, most of the rest of the party, except for Nyx, who spend some time sitting there talking to Galder and learning a little bit about the city. Traveled with Luther. They went back to the Bifrost portal where they had arrived and cut north, eventually coming to a large bridge which had a cliff underneath it, and the bridge two islands. And as they went up, they realized that they were floating in what looked like a sea of clouds, um, and that there were these huge islands just floating in these clouds. And once they'd been about halfway across the bridge, uh, Luther pulled up his horn and began to play. Now, for this, I used Morning in Slag Ravine because it's one of my favorite pieces of music from film ever. If you are familiar with it, I think you would agree it's very good. Uh, if you aren't familiar with it, I definitely recommend. I think it's Morning in the Slag Ravine. I think that's what it's called. Um, it's from I believe it's from Castle in the Sky, which is pretty funny. So Luther began blowing his horn after a bit of an explanation, not much of one, of what was going on. And it was very loud, and it very much was radiating across the entire city, this noise. And that's when, from beneath the clouds, being stirred by the sound of the music, came a flurry of whales. And as they breached the clouds, this long trail of blue energy and mist would sort of spawn off of them. And it quickly became just this dance of 15 or 20 whales breaching and playing to the sound of the music as morning had come. And during all this, Nyx was asking Gelder about Luthor and what he does. And Gelder had explained that Luther and a few other people are responsible for waking the city, um, which Nyx can attributed to like being a rooster or a cock. But everyone else get to see the things he wakes up, though. However, he was also very early at doing this. So after he'd completed, he quickly told everyone to skedoodle out of there. Uh, because he would have waked a lot of the giants with that as well. And they normally do this a few hours later in the day to give the giants more sleep. And yeah, some people were a little grumpy. For some reason, Blair decided to activate her boots of speed to run back. Luther was able to keep relative pace. He was behind her, but close. Moors flew off back towards the location they came, and Kieran just walked slowly, eventually getting just drenched by one of the whales as they began sort of migrating from the outer sea to the area under the bridge, still jumping. She just got sort of sprayed by this ice cold water, which made her quite upset. And after she was prestidigitated, dry and blow dried by Luther with his horn, she was quite poofy. The rest of the party ate and then went to lay down. Nyx and Kieran stayed up and talked a little bit more with Luther, who answered some of their questions about Laputa and the city, but he kept it all very vague. He was technically working at the time as a bouncer for the hall, so he was still trying to do his job, but still interact with these newcomers. And he really seemed to enjoy teasing Nyx, who rather exasperatedly referred to him as a rapscallion. To which Luther replied with what something the rest of the party would learn as one of his signature lines is, "I'm sure I've been called worse by better, so it's fine, don't worry about it." Uh, and the party, eventually Kieran and Nyx went up to the room as well. Luther told them where to find some spare blankets. They went up and found that Moors and Riok were just huddled in a corner, not using any of the furniture. Blair and Acer just passed out on one of the couches, no blankets. So they went upstairs to the bedroom, got some spare blankets, and then the two of them rested on the bed, which they discovered was a water bed and just had this constant soothing wave-like motion to it, which Nyx found very confusing, and just was really weirded out by it. Uh, After several hours, a knock came to the door, and Nyx went and discovered that Riok's cousin, Estevel, had arrived, and that he had come to pick them up for their day. Riok at this point was making it pretty clear that he was not super excited to be seeing his father. After, again, it had been revealed to the party over the course of these last two sessions that Riok's father had saved him when he was very young, like an egg, before he had hatched, and taken him here, and had done his best to raise him, but Riok had always felt his father a little overbearing, and so about 10 years ago had run away. And by run away, I mean had jumped off the side of this flying castle, this floating city, and used his ability as a AVX. Though, again, Riok is playing a modification of the AVX because he wanted to use, I think it was Humblewood. I think he wanted to use one of the Humblewood races instead of my homebrew AVX class, who just have flying. Because they have wings. They're more like Avens from Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that property, where they have 4 arms, legs, and wings. Whereas Riok doesn't. He just has very feathery arms that he can use to glide. Which he glided all the way down off the edge of the city, but went missing for 10 years. So, as we found out earlier when he first met Estevel, they just think he's dead. And apparently, that had a bit of a hard hit to his father. But before any of this, Estevel informed them that the Jarl, who Riok knows as Sokar Skycutter, had requested to see them since Estevel had brought strangers to their city, something that not normally is allowed. The Jarl wanted to check out and make sure everything was okay. And Riok was trying to, like, wiggle his way out of potentially having to go see his father. But the rest of the group was like, oh, the boss of this place wants to see us to make sure we're not a threat to his place. Alright, let's go. So they made their way out. I believe they asked about Luther, and Estevel said that he just sort of gets around, and he's sure they'll see him again if they stick around. I'm pretty sure. Once outside, Estevel removed the beads that sort of trap him in a medium-sized body, and he swelled back up to his normal giant form, picked everyone up, and carried them away. Across the bridge they'd been on earlier with the whales, and into the Highlands, the second island, which has 2 very large forges, a extremely large garrison with this whole open area for training grounds and tournament grounds. It's where a lot of the festivals the Giants hold is held. It's just a very, very large, open, grassy space. They also saw the hospital, which is an extremely large building, large enough for Giants to be able to move through several floors of the building. And beyond that, they see the castle of Valhalla, which is titanic. It is a castle in the sky, large enough for cloud giants to just use as a regular castle. There's levels, there's floors, it's very big. And along their way, I think 2 of them spotted an odd-looking giant up at one of the towers. A woman with sort of yellowed skin and green hair. It stood out because most of the cloud giants they've seen have had extremely pale, almost like marble skin, and hair anywheres from platinum blonde to snow white. Um, the humans and the shorter folk they've seen all have much more variety, though the humans all, for the most part, have the same skin tone and eye color, which is a very dark tan, like Luthor, who I didn't describe earlier. But Luthor has very dark tan skin and very bright red eyes, almost like a ruby or a scarlet. Uh, and the people who spotted the giant rolled so well on their perception that it looked like they were talking to someone who looked like Luthor. But this was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feet away and straight up. So it was a really hard angle to see. Uh, but they rolled like 25 on their perception, so they got some information. At which point they got to the two guard giants. The oh, excuse me, the doorkeepers. After performing a ceremonial bow and waiting for a moment, they opened the doors as Tavel set them down, and they walked into the main hall of Valhalla, um, which is really just this huge open area where giants are able to congregate around just a titanic fire pit that's like 40 feet around. And on the opposite side, there are two thrones, one giant-sized and one which the current Jarl is sitting on. Sokar, as Riok is aware, but hadn't told anyone, is a half-giant. And in fact, the first half-giant to ever be Jarl. And Riok has heard many legends about how this happened from one of his friends, Kensley, a half-giant, half-dwarf that lives within the city as well. And sort of just is like a courier, does a lot of running around. And just was one of Riok's few friends when he lived here. And Kensley always told him a different story about Sokar, the legend of Sokar. But the general consensus is that he fought his giant father, the previous Jarl, in a duel about 80 odd years ago. 83 years ago in timeline, I think. And ended up fighting him to a draw. The two of them managed to knock each other out. Which is impressive since Sokar's father would have been about 29 feet tall, and Sokar is about 9 feet tall. There's a big difference between a half-giant and a giant. We do have art of Sokar. There he is. All 115 odd years of himself, 108 years of himself. He's getting on in years. Unfortunately, it's a little cropped, so you can't see Cloud Cleaver, his axe, fully, but it's made with this beautiful blue metal that they've seen throughout the city that appears to be mined here, and none of them really know what it is. So Sokar basically just wanted to see these strangers in his lands and get a real good view of them. If he's going to welcome potential refugees into his city, he wants to understand once hunting them. So he goes around and gives everyone a bit of a stare down. And they converse. They had a bit of a conversation. Riok seemed surprised that Sokar knew of him, but of course Sokar explained that the only reason Riok was even here was because his father had asked for permission to raise him. Because again, bringing outsiders into Laputa, especially what is supposed to be a permanent residence, is like you gotta ask for that kind of shit. You don't just immigrate for free. You gotta go through an immigration process, which Riok had no idea his father had done. And Sokar brought up some troubling things that seemed to imply that Riok's father wasn't doing very well. There had been a lot of complaints about his father's shop and stuff of that nature, as well as mentioning that one of his companions would be quite interested in Nixandra, and that he'd be contacting his companion to see if he could join them and visit, because he is sort of a standing order from his friend that if he ever finds anyone who looks quite like Nyx, who, though an elf, looks a little different, and no one's really pushed into that yet. uh, which is fair. And Kieran, who's a bard, not just a bard, but a bard who specifically is just enraptured with stories. Kieran's whole reason she left home was merely she was like, oh, all these old stories of the past 80, 100, 200 years are all super cool, but I want to go see my own stories, and I want to make my own stories. And that's what Kieran, why Kieran left, and why Kieran wanted to go somewhere as bustling as the metropolis in the desert. It was so exotic to her. And the more that Sokar is interacting with the group, and the more that Kieran's thinking of the name Sokar, the more she realizes that he is literally one of the myths in one of her stories. There was at this point, the group learns a little bit about a bit of lore, which was exciting for me because I get to geek out about major events in my setting. But about 83, 84 years ago, a war ended. The war technically started 8 years before that. I believe it's either 8 or 7 in my notes. I don't remember exactly. Um, but in this war, several million people were lost. Lives were lost between all races. As a wizard by the name of Raj Al Khan managed to acquire a powerful artifact, um, and ended up just wiping out entire swaths of populations, and raising them as undead to just create this massive, truly astounding army. Um, and eventually, nations put aside differences, rallied forces together, and were able to defeat him. And in the legends and myths and stories and songs of this war, it often speaks about a companion of friends, a ship, actually, the crew of a ship. Uh, in some myths, they're just adventurers, and others, they're pirates turned heroes. Uh, the truth is very clouded, as it's been 83 years. Um, but from what Kieran knows, Sokar was one of those people 83 years ago. He was one of the adventurers on that ship. And the more he's talking about his friend, um, who at this point Blair asks if he knows anyone who could help her with the mental blocks on her mind, and this caught me off guard because I was like, oh shit, he totally does. Oh no, okay, we'll see how this goes. Um, and he explained that his companion, a man named Ithran, has in his possession a powerful artifact that allows him to access the minds of others. At this point, Kieran is like shook, because at the end of the war, at least in all the myths and tales and songs, Aethrin, the figure who led the ship, the captain of that ship, who rallied these nations and did all these great actions during the war that managed to undercut the enemy and unify the allies to an inevitable victory, an eventual victory, not inevitable, but an eventual victory. That at the end of the war, it's believed, at least in the myths and songs and legends, that he ascended into some form of godhood or demigodhood or immortality, some sort of state of being beyond mortal. Uh, and Kieran is just like freaking out, having a mixture of just awe, confusion, starstruckedness, and it's just like sort of riding this wave, uh, which was really fun for me. But Sokar informed Blair that his companion could theoretically help her. And once they did tell him about the cult, to which Riok was like, and I'm sure there's no way they could ever come here. To which everyone else in the group except Nyx was like, yeah, except for the dragon they have. And then Riok's like, I fucking forgot about the dragon. uh, but whatever. Sokar seemed more excited that they might be hunted, especially at the idea of having to face a dragon. Sokar's old. He's getting on in his years, and they don't let him. He doesn't get as many opportunities to be that figure. But he eventually decides that they're fine to stay as long as they need, and in fact, inform them that he might actually have work for them if they wanted to earn a little bit of coin while they were here, sort of work towards earning their keep a bit. Um, and he suggested they continue using Luther's room. Apparently, Luther is quite close to Sokar. He was described as having the Jarl's ear, and the two are quite good friends. So, if they stay at Luther's residence, it gives the Jarl easy access to them. At which point they were dismissed to go visit Riok's dad. So, Riok attempted several times to get out of it, but did not. At which point Estevel returned, collected the group, and made their way across the city, back to the lowlands, into the trade and residential districts, and through the streets closer and closer to the store where Riok was raised. And Riok, though he had never spent much time out of the city, was beginning to recognize parts of the skyline, the structures, as buildings he could see from his room, just from a new angle. And he started getting pretty fluffed up and concerned. And when they finally turned onto the street where he knew the shop was, they discovered this ratty, worn-out, poorly maintained building that with the windows shuttered closed and curtains drawn, and it just looks like no one's maintained the house in about a decade. It just looks awful. And beside that, they noticed a much smaller building where a few giants and their children were entering, and leaving with toys. At this point, the group discovered that Riok's father was a toy maker. And Estevel set Riok down because his adopted father, Halder, is a toy maker and does make giant-sized toys, but he does cater to the shorter residents as well. And there is a medium-sized door to the house. Upon entering, Riok discovered that it looked like no one had been around in a while, except for a track of giant-sized footsteps heading in and upstairs towards his father's workshop, which was the room his bedroom was adjacent to, as it was the room in the house where his father spent most of his time, which Riok imagined probably was Estevel, but the whole place seemed to be in shambles, dusty, covered in giant-sized cobwebs, and just mess and filth. The rest of the party, since Estevel decided that Riok probably needed to do this alone, at least at first, went to the toy shop. Riok took his time and walked across this giant-sized structure, and found that the footsteps were going upstairs, and then proceeded to take 20 and climb his way up the stairs and enter into his father's workshop, which just was in absolute shambles. And there was very little light. But as he got in, he could hear the sound of a giant breathing in the darkness, and a bit of the light sort of passing through. And when his eyes adjusted to it, he saw his father, which we also have art of. His father, covered in dirt and grime, sitting down against the ground, his face sort of weathered and lined, his hair just sort of wild and untamed and greasy, his hair mixing with his long and greasy beard. Nothing like the clean and proper, pulled back clean ponytail, the clothes that always looked well worn but very clean, that Riok remembered his father wearing or looking. And Riok sort of is shocked by all this and calls up to him, and slowly the older giant opens an eye and looks at Riok, and said something along the lines of another dream come to haunt me kind of deal. And that's where we ended the session, with Riok being pseudo reunited with his father. And we'll see where that conversation goes in the next session. Um, I hope everyone had fun listening to this. It wasn't a super exciting session in terms of combat or even exploration, but it had a lot of really fun scenes and a lot of role play, which was exciting. And I'm looking forward to where Riok and Haldair go with their conversation, and if everyone else is going to enjoy the toy store. And I have some plans in mind for making Laputa quite exciting. If you have any questions, comments, or anything else, please leave them down below. This is my first time recording from a new PC, so my recording settings are probably not super accurate or different. So if there's a difference in audio quality, video quality, I'm sorry. I haven't fiddled with the settings on OBS that much on the new laptop, though I'm going to try. My biggest issue with the new laptop is just that it doesn't have a whole ton of hard drive space, and these videos can get pretty chunky. Um, but hopefully that's not too big of a deal. And I have an external nearby somewheres in emergencies. But yeah, thank you. Again, no Frontier video this week. However, Pirates and Calimare, or the city, should be back to their regular recordings, barring any future attendance issues. I want to thank you for coming by, and have a great day.